Right now, Earth is holding you hostage, not with chains or walls, but with an invisible force so relentless that escaping it requires burning 90% of everything you launch into nothing but exhaust. Every rocket ever built is mostly fuel. Every mission ever flown is a negotiation with a force that never compromises and never sleeps. Gravity does not care about your engineering. It does not care about your ambition. It simply demands a tax so steep that most of what you carry exists only to pay for the privilege of leaving. We are going to walk through exactly why gravity is not just a challenge of space travel, but the single most punishing constraint the universe imposes on anything that tries to move between worlds. On July 16th, 1969, the most powerful machine ever constructed by human hands stood motionless on a concrete pad in southern Florida. The Saturn V rocket towered 110 meters above the swamp, taller than the Statue of Liberty from base to torch tip. Fully loaded with crew, cargo and propellant, it weighed approximately 6.5 million pounds. Inside the tiny capsule perched at the very top sat 3 human beings whose combined body weight amounted to roughly 500 pounds. Everything beneath them, every rivet, every weld, every frozen tank of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, every turbo pump spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute, existed for a single purpose: to fight gravity long enough for those 3 men to leave Earth. When the 5 F1 engines ignited, they produced 7.5 million pounds of thrust, burning kerosene and liquid oxygen at a rate of approximately 13 metric tons per second. The sound alone was powerful enough to kill a person standing too close. The ground shook for miles. And all of that fury, all of that engineering, all of that expenditure of energy and money and human ingenuity was directed at one adversary, not the vacuum of space, not cosmic radiation, not the vast distance to the moon. The adversary was the planet itself, pulling downward at 9.8 meters per second squared, demanding that every kilogram aboard justify its presence by carrying enough energy to climb out of the deepest gravity, well, any of it would ever encounter. Approximately 92% of the Saturn V's total mass was propellant. The rocket that carried humanity to the moon was, by weight, almost entirely fuel. The astronauts, their capsule, their scientific instruments, their food, their water, all of it amounted to a thin sliver, balanced atop a controlled column of fire, whose only job was to escape the grip of a world that does not let go cheaply. This is the foundational truth of space travel that most people never fully internalize. The primary obstacle is not what waits in space. It is what stands between you and space. Getting off the ground, against the persistent pull of Earth's gravitational field, is so overwhelmingly expensive in terms of energy and mass that it dictates the design of every launch vehicle, the budget of every mission, and the architecture of every spacecraft ever built. Gravity is not a dramatic opponent. It does not explode or burn or tear things apart. It simply sits beneath you, constant and quiet, demanding a tax so steep that entire industries have been constructed around the singular challenge of paying it. Every space agency on Earth, every private launch company, every mission planner in history begins their work by confronting this same immovable reality. Before you can worry about surviving in space, you must first afford to leave the ground. To understand why the tax is so extreme, you need to understand what escape velocity actually demands. Every object with mass generates a gravitational field. The more massive the object and the closer you are to its center, the stronger the field pulls. Earth's escape velocity The speed an object must reach to break free of the planet's gravitational hold without any further propulsion is approximately 11.2 kilometers per second. That translates to roughly 25,000 miles per hour. This is not the speed required to reach orbit, which is somewhat lower at about 7.8 kilometers per second. This is the speed required to leave Earth entirely and never fall back. To appreciate what 11.2 kilometers per second means, consider that a bullet fired from a military rifle travels at roughly 1 kilometer per second. Escape velocity demands a speed more than 11 times faster than a bullet. No mechanism humans have ever devised can simply hurl a payload to that speed in an instant. Instead, rockets sustain continuous thrust over minutes, clawing upward against gravity every second of the ascent, burning propellant at rates measured in tons per second, just to maintain acceleration against a force that never relents. Here is where the problem transitions from difficult to exponential. A rocket must carry fuel to generate thrust, but fuel has mass. That mass must itself be accelerated, which requires additional fuel, and that additional fuel has its own mass, which demands still more fuel beneath it. This cascading dependency is captured conceptually in the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation, formulated in 1897. The equation reveals that the relationship between the velocity change a rocket needs and the mass of fuel required to achieve it is not linear, it is exponential. Doubling the required speed does not double the fuel. It roughly squares the fuel-to-payload ratio. Tripling it pushes the ratio into territory that makes engineers reach for stronger words than difficult. Consider what this means in practice. For a chemical rocket burning liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, the most efficient chemical propellant combination known, the effective exhaust velocity is roughly 4.4 kilometers per second. To reach low Earth orbit, accounting for atmospheric drag and gravity losses during ascent, a rocket needs approximately 9.4 kilometers per second of total velocity change. When you work through the exponential relationship between required velocity and fuel mass, you discover that between 85 and 90% of the rocket's total mass at liftoff must be propellant. This is not a failure of engineering. It is not a consequence of outdated technology. It is the direct, unavoidable output of physics. The exponential function linking velocity change to mass ratio is a law of nature, as fixed and non-negotiable as the speed of light. You can build lighter structures, optimize engine chemistry, and streamline every component, but you cannot alter the shape of the exponential curve. It bends upward, always upward, punishing every additional meter per second of velocity with a compounding mass penalty that no cleverness can flatten. The Saturn V made this reality visible on the grandest possible scale. Its first stage, the SIC, consumed approximately 2,160 metric tons of kerosene and liquid oxygen in approximately 2.5 minutes of powered flight. Those 150 seconds of thundering combustion lifted the vehicle through the densest portion of the atmosphere and accelerated it to roughly 2,400 meters per second, about 1/4 of orbital velocity. Then the first stage was discarded, dropped into the Atlantic Ocean, its job finished. The second stage, the S2, fired next, burning liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen to push the remaining stack closer to orbital speed. It too was discarded after roughly 6 minutes. The third stage, the SIVB, completed orbital insertion and later provided the thrust for the translunar injection burn that sent the spacecraft toward the Moon. By the time the crew was on a path to the Moon, more than 95% of the vehicle they had launched with was gone, jettisoned, spent, abandoned to the ocean or left tumbling in orbit. The astronauts rode onward in a spacecraft that represented a tiny fraction of the original launch mass. This staging strategy, assembling a rocket from multiple sections and dropping each one after its fuel is exhausted, is itself a direct consequence of gravity's exponential tax. Carrying an empty fuel tank upward wastes energy, because you are accelerating mass that no longer contributes anything to the mission. By jettisoning spent stages, you reduce the mass that subsequent engines must push, allowing them to achieve more velocity change from their fuel load. Staging is not an elegant design choice. It is a compromise forced by physics. You are discarding expensive hardware after minutes of use because gravity penalizes dead weight so severely that throwing away entire rocket sections is more efficient than carrying them. Every launch vehicle ever designed, from the early Atlas missiles to the modern Falcon 9 to NASA's Space Launch System, uses some form of staging because the alternative, a single-stage vehicle carrying all its propellant and structure to orbit, demands mass ratios so extreme that almost no useful payload remains. What makes Earth's gravity particularly punishing for spaceflight is our planet's specific combination of mass and radius. Earth is the largest and most massive rocky planet in our solar system. Its surface gravity of 9.8 meters per second squared places it in a frustrating position strong enough that leaving requires extraordinary expenditure, but not so strong that chemical propulsion fails entirely. We exist at the ragged edge of what chemical rockets can manage. A civilization arising on a smaller world would face a fundamentally easier challenge. Mars, for example, has a surface gravity of approximately 3.7 meters per second squared and an escape velocity of roughly 5 kilometers per second, less than half of Earth's. The fuel fraction needed to leave Mars is dramatically smaller. A rocket launching from Mars could carry a far greater proportion of useful payload relative to its total mass. The exponential penalty still applies, but the exponent is much smaller when the required velocity is lower. On the other extreme, consider Jupiter. Its escape velocity exceeds 59 kilometers per second. If Jupiter had a solid surface and a civilization attempted to launch a chemical rocket from it, the mass ratio required would be so astronomically large that no practical vehicle could be built. The fuel required to carry the fuel required to carry the fuel would cascade beyond any conceivable structural limit. Some planetary scientists have speculated that intelligent species evolving on super-Earth's rocky planets, significantly more massive than our own, might be permanently imprisoned by their gravity wells. Their chemistry might be identical to ours, their intelligence equal or superior, but the exponential cost of escaping a deeper gravity well could make spaceflight physically impossible for them. Earth happens to sit in a narrow band where leaving is achievable but agonizingly expensive, a cosmic boundary between access and imprisonment drawn by the mass of the rock beneath our feet. The cost of gravity cascades far beyond the fuel tanks. Every kilogram of payload you want to deliver to orbit requires roughly 50 to 100 kilograms of total rocket mass at liftoff, depending on the vehicle. This amplification ratio means that small changes in payload mass translate into enormous changes in launch mass. Adding 10 kilograms of scientific instruments to a spacecraft might require adding 500 kilograms of propellant and structure to the launch vehicle that carries it. This sensitivity to weight pervades every aspect of spacecraft design. Engineers spend years and millions of dollars shaving grams from individual components. They use carbon fiber composites instead of aluminum, titanium alloys instead of steel, honeycomb panel construction instead of solid sheets. They machine parts to the thinnest possible tolerances. They eliminate redundancies that would be standard in terrestrial engineering. They accept risk margins that would be unthinkable in any other industry. All of this effort exists because gravity's exponential penalty transforms every excess gram at the top of the rocket into dozens of excess grams at the bottom. This weight obsession explains why space hardware costs so much. A communications satellite that could be built from conventional materials for a few $1,000,000 instead costs hundreds of millions, because it must be constructed from the lightest materials available, assembled in clean rooms, tested exhaustively for reliability, and verified to survive launch loads that can exceed 6 times the force of gravity. The structures must be simultaneously featherweight and extraordinarily strong. The testing must confirm that nothing will fail, because once the vehicle leaves the ground, no repair crew is coming. Every dollar spent on lightweight materials, every hour spent on testing, every iteration of design optimization traces back to the same root cause. Gravity taxes mass, and that tax is exponential. The economics of the launch industry make the same point with blunt numbers. For decades, the cost of delivering 1 kilogram of payload to low Earth orbit ranged between $10,000 and $20,000, depending on the vehicle and the market. SpaceX's Falcon 9 has reduced this to roughly $2,700 per kilogram through partial reusability, landing and reflying the first stage booster instead of discarding it after a single use. The Starship system aims to push costs below $1,000 per kilogram through full reusability of both stages. These are genuine, dramatic improvements. They represent real engineering breakthroughs, but they do not change the underlying physics. A fully reusable Falcon 9 still requires approximately 90% of its liftoff mass to be propellant. The fuel bill per launch remains hundreds of tons of kerosene and liquid oxygen. Reusability reduces the amortized hardware cost per flight, but it cannot reduce the propellant cost per kilogram of payload because that cost is set by the rocket equation and Earth's escape velocity. Gravity does not offer volume discounts. It is worth stepping back to appreciate how unusual rocketry is compared to every other form of human transportation. A commercial airliner devotes roughly 30 to 40% of its takeoff weight to fuel. A cargo ship dedicates 5 to 10%. An automobile carries fuel weighing a small fraction of its total mass. Only in rocketry does fuel constitute 90% or more of the vehicle. The reason is fundamental. Aircraft push against air. Ships push against water. Cars push against roads. Each of these vehicles leverages an external medium to generate motion. Rockets push against nothing. They carry their own reaction mass and expel it at high velocity to produce thrust. This self-contained propulsion requirement, compounded by the enormous velocity changes demanded by Earth's gravity well, creates fuel fractions that dwarf every other transportation mode humans have ever developed. People occasionally propose alternatives to rockets that might sidestep the propellant problem. Space elevators, electromagnetic catapults, laser propulsion, high-altitude launch platforms, each concept attacks the problem from a different angle. But none of them escapes gravity's fundamental energy requirement. A space elevator must support its own weight across approximately 36,000 kilometers of cable, stretching from the surface to geostationary orbit. The tensile strength required exceeds that of any material currently manufactured at scale. Carbon nanotubes theoretically possess sufficient strength, but they have never been produced in lengths beyond centimeters, let alone the thousands of kilometers a space elevator would demand. An electromagnetic catapult or railgun could accelerate payloads to orbital velocity at ground level, but the payload would need to survive acceleration forces of thousands of g-forces that would destroy any satellite, any human, and most structural materials. The payload would also enter the dense lower atmosphere at orbital speed, generating friction heating intense enough to vaporize its outer surface before it cleared the troposphere. Laser propulsion concepts push the propellant problem to the ground by using ground-based lasers to heat onboard propellant or push against a reflective surface, but they still require the payload to gain sufficient velocity to reach orbit, and the energy must still come from somewhere. Every alternative to conventional rocketry encounters gravity's demands in a different guise, but the total energy required to climb out of Earth's gravity well is fixed by physics. You can change the method of payment, you cannot change the price. If you shrank the sun to the size of a basketball and placed it on a street corner in New York City, Earth would be a grain of sand orbiting 26 meters away. The nearest star, Proxima Centauri, would be another basketball sitting in a park in Los Angeles. Between these objects stretches nothing but emptiness. That void is what space travel must cross. But before any spacecraft can begin crossing it, it must first escape from the surface of that grain of sand. And that grain of sand, small as it appears in this model, holds on with a gravitational grip so tenacious that 90% of everything launched from its surface exists only to break free of it. The total energy required to lift 1 kilogram from Earth's surface to low Earth orbit is approximately 32 million joules. That is equivalent to the energy released by burning roughly 1 liter of gasoline, except that gasoline burned in an engine produces force against a road, while rocket propellant must produce force against nothing, carrying its own reaction mass and paying the exponential penalty for doing so. The energy per kilogram is modest. The mass penalty for delivering that energy through self-contained propulsion is not. This distinction is the heart of the problem. Gravity does not demand impossible amounts of energy. It demands that the energy be delivered in a way that compounds its own cost. The tax is not on the energy itself. The tax is on the mass of the system that delivers the energy. And because that system must carry itself, the cost spirals upward with the remorseless logic of exponential growth. This is why the launch problem has dominated spaceflight for its entire history. From the first V2 tests in the 1940s to the most advanced vehicles flying today, the central engineering challenge has remained identical: how to lift useful mass from the surface of the Earth into orbit while paying gravity's exponential toll. Every other challenge of spaceflight thermal protection, life support, navigation, communication, radiation shielding, orbital mechanics only becomes relevant after the launch problem is solved. And solving the launch problem consumes the vast majority of every mission's budget, every vehicle's structural mass, and every engineer's design effort. Gravity stands at the bottom of every mission like a toll collector at a bridge, invisible, implacable, and absolute. Nothing crosses without paying. And the price, as the exponential nature of the rocket equation makes painfully clear, is always far higher than intuition suggests. Before radiation threatens a crew, before distance stretches a communication link, before microgravity weakens bones and muscles, before any of the challenges that define deep space exploration even enter the picture, gravity has already consumed the overwhelming majority of the mission's mass, energy, and budget. It is the first filter, the most expensive filter, and the one that determines whether any mission is feasible before a single other constraint is even considered. Every spacecraft that has ever reached orbit, every probe that has visited another world, every astronaut who has floated above the atmosphere, did so only because an engineering team found a way to pay gravity's price in full. No partial payments are accepted, no exemptions are granted. Gravity collects its tax on every kilogram, at every launch, without exception, and that tax is always exponential. But reaching orbit is only the first bill. What comes next reveals that gravity does not stop charging the moment you clear the atmosphere. It follows you across the solar system, imposing costs at every turn, every trajectory change, every planetary encounter. The ledger is never closed, the account is never settled, and the prices only climb from here. There is a dangerous illusion at the heart of how most people picture spaceflight. An astronaut floats weightlessly inside the International Space Station, drifting between instrument panels with a gentle push of her fingertips. Outside the window, Earth curves below in serene blue silence. Everything looks peaceful, effortless, free. The struggle appears to be over. The rocket did its job, the astronaut arrived, and now she coasts through the cosmos unshackled from the force that pinned her to the ground for her entire life. This image is a lie. Not a small distortion or a simplification for public consumption, a fundamental misrepresentation of what is actually happening. That astronaut is not floating because gravity has released her. She is floating because she is falling. The International Space Station orbits at roughly 400 kilometers above Earth's surface, an altitude where gravitational acceleration is still approximately 8.7 meters per second squared, about 89% as strong as it is on the ground. Gravity has not disappeared. It has not even weakened significantly. The astronaut and everything around her are in continuous freefall, plummeting toward Earth at every moment. The only reason they never hit the surface is that they are also moving sideways at approximately 27,600 kilometers per hour, fast enough that the curvature of their fall matches the curvature of the planet beneath them. They fall around Earth rather than into it. That is what an orbit is, not freedom from gravity, but perpetual surrender to it on terms that happen to avoid collision with the ground. This distinction is not academic, it is operationally critical, because it reveals the truth that governs every mission beyond low Earth orbit. Gravity does not let go when you reach space. It follows you. It shapes every possible trajectory. It dictates the cost of every maneuver, and it collects payment for every change in velocity a spacecraft makes, from the moment it leaves orbit around one world to the moment it arrives at another. The currency of this ongoing negotiation has a name that every mission planner knows as intimately as their own pulse: delta V, the total change in velocity a spacecraft can produce using its onboard propellant. Delta V is not speed, it is not distance, it is capacity, the sum of all velocity changes a spacecraft can afford before its fuel runs dry. Every mission has a delta V budget, calculated to the meter per second, and every maneuver draws against that budget with the finality of a withdrawal from a bank account that accepts no deposits. When the budget is spent, the mission is over. The spacecraft drifts along whatever trajectory its last burn established, unable to alter course, unable to slow down, unable to respond to anything gravity demands of it. Understanding delta V budgets requires understanding how movement works in a gravitational field, and movement in a gravitational field obeys rules that violate nearly every intuition developed on Earth's surface. On the ground, if you want to go faster, you push forward. If you want to go somewhere ahead of you, you accelerate toward it. In orbit, these instincts will kill you. If you fire your engines forward in the direction of your orbital motion, you do not simply speed up along your current path. You raise your orbit on the opposite side. Your trajectory becomes elliptical, climbing higher at the point 180 degrees ahead of where you burned. If you fire your engines backward, slowing yourself down, you do not simply decelerate. You lower your orbit on the opposite side, dropping closer to the planet half an orbit later. And here is the deeply counterintuitive consequence. If you want to catch up to a spacecraft ahead of you in the same orbit, you cannot fire your engines toward it. Burning forward raises your orbit, which makes you move slower in angular terms, and you fall further behind. Instead, you must fire backwards, slowing down, dropping into a lower orbit where you travel faster relative to the planet, and then time a subsequent burn to rise back up and meet the target. You speed up by slowing down, you approach by retreating. Every rendezvous ever performed, from the first Gemini docking tests in the 1960s to every crew vehicle arrival at the International Space Station, required pilots and computers to execute maneuvers that feel exactly backwards to terrestrial experience. Gravity writes the rules. Your intuition is not invited to the negotiation. These orbital mechanics become even more consequential when a spacecraft needs to travel between worlds. Interplanetary trajectories are not straight lines. They are curves, sections of ellipses that connect the orbit of one planet to the orbit of another, shaped entirely by the gravitational fields of the Sun and the bodies involved. The most fuel-efficient path between two planetary orbits is called a Hohmann transfer orbit, named after the German engineer Walter Hohmann, who described it in 1925. A Hohmann transfer is an elliptical orbit whose closest point to the Sun touches the inner planet's orbit and whose farthest point touches the outer planet's orbit. To enter this transfer ellipse, a spacecraft fires its engines at the departure planet, adding velocity to stretch its solar orbit outward. When it reaches the destination planet's orbital distance months or years later, it fires again to match the destination's orbital speed. 2 burns. 2 delta V expenditures, both precisely determined by the masses and distances of the Sun and planets involved. No room for creativity, no room for shortcuts. The geometry is fixed by gravitational physics. The delta V cost for each of these transfers is specific and non-negotiable. From low Earth orbit, entering a Hohmann transfer to Mars requires a velocity change of approximately 3.6 kilometers per second. This is the trans-Mars injection burn, the moment when a spacecraft commits to leaving Earth's gravitational neighborhood and falling outward along an elliptical arc toward the red planet. The burn must occur precisely the right moment in Earth's orbit and the spacecraft's orbit around Earth. Firing too early or too late wastes fuel or misses Mars entirely. The timing is dictated by the relative positions of Earth and Mars in their orbits around the Sun, which align favorably for an efficient Hohmann transfer only once every 26 months. This launch window is not an engineering constraint. It is a gravitational constraint. The planets must be in specific positions for the transfer ellipse to connect them, and gravity determines where the planets are and when they will be in the right alignment. Miss the window and you wait over 2 years for the next one. No amount of additional fuel can substitute for correct timing. Gravity sets the calendar. Arriving at Mars does not end the accounting. A spacecraft falling inward from a Hohmann transfer approaches Mars at a velocity that exceeds the planet's own orbital speed. To enter orbit around Mars, the spacecraft must shed that excess velocity. This orbital insertion burn costs roughly 1 kilometer per second of delta V, or it can be partially replaced by aerobraking, using the friction of Mars's thin atmosphere to slow down. Aerobraking trades propellant for thermal protection, exchanging fuel mass for heat shield mass. It is not free. The heat shield must be designed, built, tested, and carried from Earth through the entire transit. But it is lighter than the propellant that would otherwise be needed, which is why most Mars orbiters use it. The choice between aerobraking and propulsive capture is itself a calculation driven by gravity's demands. Every gram of heat shield is a gram you do not need to fill with fuel. Every gram of fuel saved reduces the launch mass back on Earth. The optimization extends backward through the entire mission, always tracing to the same route. Gravity taxes mass, and reducing mass at any stage reduces costs at every earlier stage. For landers, the Martian atmosphere introduces a gravitational gauntlet that has earned its own fearsome reputation. Mars's atmosphere is thick enough to generate lethal heating on an incoming vehicle. Entry temperatures can exceed 1,400 degrees Celsius, but too thin to slow a heavy spacecraft to survivable landing. Speeds on its own. Earth's atmosphere is roughly 100 times denser than Mars's. A capsule re-entering Earth's atmosphere can rely on air resistance alone to decelerate from orbital velocity to parachute deployment speed. On Mars, atmospheric drag brings the vehicle from interplanetary approach speed down to roughly supersonic velocity, but the final deceleration from supersonic to zero must be achieved through other means. Parachutes help, but in that thin air they cannot bring a heavy lander to a gentle stop. The remaining velocity, often several hundred meters per second, must be killed by rocket engines firing downward against the surface. Every kilogram of fuel burned during those final seconds was carried from Earth, across interplanetary space, through the furnace of atmospheric entry, and held in reserve for a landing sequence that lasts minutes and permits no errors. The Curiosity and Perseverance rovers each used a sky crane system that lowered the rover on cables from a hovering, rocket-powered descent stage. The system worked flawlessly both times, but its existence, its complexity, its mass, its engineering cost is a direct artifact of Mars's gravity being too strong for parachutes alone, and its atmosphere being too thin to do what Earth's atmosphere does routinely. Gravity at Mars set the problem. Gravity at Earth set the cost of launching the solution. The delta V map of the solar system looks like a highway toll system, where every on-ramp, exit and interchange has a fixed price posted in meters per second. From low Earth orbit to lunar transfer costs approximately 3.1 kilometers per second. Lunar orbit insertion costs roughly 840 meters per second. From low Earth orbit to a Mars transfer costs about 3.6 kilometers per second. Mars orbit insertion, if done propulsively, costs roughly 1 kilometer per second. Reaching Jupiter transfer orbit from Earth costs approximately 6.3 kilometers per second. Saturn requires about 7.3. Each number represents a gravitational toll, the energy price for changing your orbit from one configuration to another within the Sun's gravitational field. You can look at these numbers and read the story of human spaceflight in them. We have sent humans to destinations costing up to about 16 kilometers per second of total mission delta V, which is what Apollo required for a round trip to the Moon. Robotic probes have reached destinations costing considerably more, but only by using gravity assists to borrow velocity they could not afford to generate themselves. No spacecraft has ever carried enough propellant to fly a direct, unassisted trajectory to the outer planets. Gravity's prices are simply too high. The fragility of delta V budgets becomes viscerally real when you examine what happens if a mission encounters the unexpected. Every trajectory is designed with correction margins, small reserves of delta V set aside for mid-course adjustments. These reserves are typically measured in tens of meters per second, a tiny fraction of the total budget. They exist because no launch is perfect, no burn is executed with infinite precision, and no trajectory follows its mathematical ideal through the real solar system with its subtle gravitational perturbations. But those reserves are thin. They have to be, because every meter per second of delta V held in reserve requires propellant mass, and propellant mass compounds backward through every preceding phase. A generous correction margin means a heavier spacecraft, which means more fuel for every maneuver, which means a larger launch vehicle. Mission designers balance razor-thin between reserving enough delta V for contingencies and keeping the spacecraft light enough to accomplish its primary mission. A single unexpected event, a thruster that fires slightly off-axis, a trajectory that drifts further than modeled, a navigation error that requires an unplanned correction burn, can consume the entire reserve in one stroke. What follows is a grim exercise in triage. Engineers recalculate remaining delta V. They determine which planned maneuvers can be reduced or eliminated. They decide which scientific objectives can be sacrificed to preserve enough fuel for mission-critical burns like orbital insertion. The spacecraft's capability shrinks in real time, not because any system has failed, but because gravity's toll on an unplanned maneuver has depleted the budget for everything that follows. Gravity assists are the only mechanism available for partially offsetting these costs, and they deserve close examination because they reveal both the cleverness of human engineering and the absolute dominance of gravity over mission design. A gravity assist works by exploiting the gravitational field of a planet to change a spacecraft's velocity without burning any fuel. When a spacecraft approaches a planet, it falls into the planet's gravity well, accelerating as it descends. As it swings past and climbs back out of the well, it decelerates by exactly the same amount relative to the planet. But the planet itself is moving through space, orbiting the Sun at tens of kilometers per second. If the spacecraft's trajectory is designed so that it passes behind the planet in its orbit, the planet's gravity tugs the spacecraft forward, adding the planet's own orbital velocity to the spacecraft's solar trajectory. The spacecraft gains speed relative to the Sun, while the planet loses an infinitesimal fraction of its orbital energy, a quantity so small it is unmeasurable, equivalent to slowing Jupiter's orbit by roughly 1 centimeter per trillion years. The result is that the spacecraft leaves the encounter moving faster relative to the Sun than when it arrived, having burned no propellant. The energy came from the planet's orbital motion, transferred through gravity. It sounds like cheating. It is not. It is borrowing, and gravity sets every term of the loan. The spacecraft must arrive at the assisting planet at precisely the right time, from precisely the right direction, at precisely the right speed. The approach geometry determines the magnitude and direction of the velocity change. A steeper approach yields a larger boost, but requires a closer flyby, increasing risk. A shallower approach yields less benefit, but provides a wider safety margin. There is no flexibility in the physics. The gravitational field of the assisting planet is what it is. You can design your approach, but you cannot redesign the field. The Voyager missions demonstrate both the power and the constraints of this technique. Voyager 2, launched in 1977, used gravity assists from Jupiter, Saturn, and Uranus to reach Neptune in 1989. Without these assists, reaching Neptune with direct propulsion would have required a delta-V budget far exceeding anything the Titan III launch vehicle could provide. The mission was possible only because a rare alignment of the 4 outer planets, occurring roughly once every 175 years, allowed a trajectory that threaded the spacecraft past each one in sequence, gaining velocity at every encounter. The alignment dictated the launch window. Gravity dictated the trajectory. The engineers designed the spacecraft. But the mission profile was not a product of human choice. It was a product of planetary positions that gravity determined hundreds of millions of years before humans existed. Even with 3 gravity assists, Voyager 2 reached Neptune traveling at approximately 17 kilometers per second relative to the Sun. That sounds fast, and it is, by spacecraft standards. But relative to the speed of light, it is vanishing roughly 1/18,000th of light speed. The fastest objects humanity has ever launched are still crawling through the solar system at velocities that would require tens of thousands of years to reach the nearest star. Gravity assists can boost a spacecraft's speed by a few kilometers per second per encounter. Reaching velocities that would make interstellar travel practical, 10% of light speed or more, would require velocity changes 1,000 times larger than anything gravity assists can provide. The technique that makes outer solar system exploration possible is simultaneously a reminder of how tightly gravity constrains the velocities we can achieve. The Cassini mission to Saturn illustrates the extreme trajectory design that gravity assists sometimes demand. Launched in 1997, Cassini performed 2 gravity assists at Venus, one at Earth and one at Jupiter, before reaching Saturn in 2004. The spacecraft's trajectory resembled a tangled knot more than a straight line. It flew inward toward the Sun twice, looped past its home planet years after launch, then arced outward through the asteroid belt and past Jupiter, before arriving at its destination 7 years after leaving Earth. This convoluted path was not chosen for scientific opportunity along the way. It was chosen because the Titan 4B rocket that launched Cassini could not provide enough delta V to send the spacecraft directly to Saturn. The gravitational tolls between Earth orbit and Saturn orbit were higher than the launch vehicle could pay in a single transaction. Gravity assists spread the payment across multiple encounters with multiple planets, each one contributing a fraction of the total velocity change needed. The mission architecture was shaped not by what scientists wanted, but by what gravity permitted. NASA's Juno spacecraft, designed to study Jupiter, reveals an even more striking example of gravity's dominance over trajectory planning. Juno launched in August 2011 atop an Atlas V rocket. Despite heading for Jupiter, the spacecraft first flew outward past Mars's orbit, then looped back inward toward the Sun, and performed a gravity assist flyby of Earth in October 2013, more than 2 years after launch. The spacecraft returned to the planet it had just left, passing within 560 kilometers of Earth's surface, using our planet's gravity to gain the velocity it needed to reach Jupiter. This detour added 2 years to the mission timeline. It consumed no propellant for the velocity boost itself, but required precise navigation burns to set up the flyby geometry. The absurdity of the situation, leaving Earth only to come back and borrow velocity from the same gravitational field you just paid to escape, captures the reality of interplanetary travel under gravity's rules. You pay the toll to leave, then you circle back to collect a partial rebate on the planet's schedule at the planet's terms. And then you continue outward, hoping the rebate was large enough to cover the tolls ahead. The lunar missions illuminate gravity's ongoing costs in the most human terms available. The total delta V budget for an Apollo mission from the launch pad to the lunar surface and back to Earth was approximately 15.9 kilometers per second. The breakdown reveals where gravity extracted its payments. Roughly 9.4 kilometers per second went to reaching low Earth orbit. 3.1 went to the translunar injection burn. 840 meters per second went to entering lunar orbit. 1,600 went to the powered descent to the surface. 1,800 went to the ascent from the surface, back to lunar orbit. The remaining budget covered mid-course corrections, rendezvous maneuvers, and the trans-Earth injection burn for the journey home. Each of these numbers was fixed by the gravitational fields of Earth and the Moon. The engineers could not negotiate a lower rate. They could only design a vehicle capable of paying each toll in sequence, while retaining enough propellant for the next one. The margins were astonishing in their thinness. During Apollo 11's powered descent to the Sea of Tranquility, Neil Armstrong had to take manual control to steer away from a boulder field that threatened the landing site. The additional maneuvering consumed fuel that had not been budgeted for unexpected navigation. When the lunar module's contact probes touched the surface, approximately 25 seconds of descent fuel remained. 25 seconds separated the first moon landing from a mission abort that would have forced the astronauts to blast back to orbit without landing, wasting years of effort and billions of dollars. That razor-thin margin was not the result of poor planning. It was the result of gravity taking its maximum toll at every phase. The vehicle carried as much fuel as it could, given the mass constraints imposed by every preceding phase. There was no reserve because there was no mass budget for a reserve. Gravity had consumed everything else. Mars demands even steeper accounting. The delta V required for a one-way trip from low Earth orbit to the Martian surface is approximately 7 kilometers per second, combining the trans-Mars injection, mid-course corrections, atmospheric entry, and powered landing. A round trip roughly doubles this figure. The return requires escaping Mars, cruising back to Earth, and surviving re-entry. But the doubling is not symmetric. The return delta V must be carried as propellant mass from the beginning of the mission, which means it must be launched from Earth, carried through transit, and landed on Mars before it is used. This compounding of mass through every phase transforms a round-trip Mars mission from an ambitious undertaking into a logistical enormity that has defeated every serious planning effort for over half a century. The fuel for the return trip is deadweight during every phase except the return, but gravity taxes deadweight the same as it taxes useful payload. It charges full price for every kilogram regardless of when that kilogram becomes useful. Orbital insertion and capture burns at planetary destinations represent another category of gravity's tolls that mission designers must pay with precision or not at all. When a spacecraft arrives at a planet after an interplanetary transfer, it is typically moving too fast relative to that planet to be captured into orbit. Without a deliberate braking maneuver, the spacecraft will fly past, bending its trajectory through the planet's gravitational field, but continuing outward on a modified solar orbit. To actually enter orbit to become a satellite of the destination world, the spacecraft must fire its engines retrograde, shedding velocity until gravity can capture it into a bound orbit. The delta V cost of this capture depends on the arrival velocity and the depth of the planet's gravity well. For Mars, a propulsive orbital insertion costs roughly 1 kilometer per second. For Jupiter, the situation is far more extreme. Juno's Jupiter orbit insertion burn in July 2016 required approximately 540 meters per second of delta V, a relatively modest figure achieved only because mission designers placed Juno on a highly elliptical capture orbit that minimized the braking requirement. A low circular orbit around Jupiter would have required vastly more fuel, likely making the mission impossible with any existing launch vehicle. Even Juno's comparatively gentle capture burn consumed a significant fraction of its remaining propellant. The burn lasted 35 minutes during which the spacecraft's engine had to perform flawlessly, with no backup, no abort option, and no second chance. If the engine had failed to ignite, 5 years of flight time and over $1 billion would have sailed past Jupiter and into the outer solar system, forever lost. Gravity dictated the price of arrival. The engine either paid it or the mission ended. The deeper you travel into the solar system, the more gravity charges for every transaction. Saturn orbit insertion, if done propulsively, requires roughly 1.5 kilometers per second of delta V for a high eccentricity capture orbit. Cassini accomplished this with a 96-minute engine burn in July 2004, the longest and most critical burn of the mission. Engineers had calculated the fuel load for this burn years in advance, accounting for the mass of propellant consumed during the 7-year cruise, the trajectory adjustments required by 4 gravity assists, and the precise approach geometry at Saturn. Every drop of fuel expended during the cruise reduced the amount available for orbit insertion. Every kilogram of spacecraft mass increased the fuel required for the burn. The accounting was relentless. One unexpected maneuver, one leaky thruster, one trajectory error that required extra correction, and the remaining fuel might not have been enough to enter Saturn orbit. Gravity set the price. The engineers budgeted for it. The margin for error was measured in single-digit percentages of the total fuel supply. Even station-keeping maintaining a spacecraft's orbit after arrival drains the delta-V budget that gravity demands. Orbits are not static. Gravitational perturbations from nearby moons, from the Sun, from irregularities in a planet's gravitational field gradually alter a spacecraft's trajectory. Without periodic correction burns, the orbit degrades, sometimes catastrophically. Satellites in low Earth orbit experience drag from the tenuous upper atmosphere, slowly losing altitude. Without reboosts, they re-enter and burn up. The International Space Station requires regular propulsive reboosts, each consuming propellant that was launched from Earth at enormous cost. Geostationary communications satellites carry enough fuel for roughly 15 years of station-keeping burns. When the fuel runs out, the satellite cannot maintain its orbital position. It drifts, becomes useless, and is either boosted to a graveyard orbit or left to decay. The satellite's instruments might function perfectly for another decade. Its solar panels might generate full power. But without fuel to fight gravity's perturbations, the mission ends. Gravity does not destroy the spacecraft. It simply stops receiving the payments required to remain in the correct orbit, and the spacecraft drifts into irrelevance. Reaching the Sun itself reveals one of gravity's most counterintuitive tolls. Common sense suggests that falling toward the Sun should be easy. Just stop orbiting and let gravity pull you inward. But Earth orbits the Sun at approximately 30 kilometers per second. To fall directly into the Sun, a spacecraft must cancel nearly all of that orbital velocity. The delta-V cost roughly 30 kilometers per second exceeds the cost of reaching Jupiter. The Sun's gravity gave Earth its orbital velocity for free as a natural consequence of the planet's formation. But now that velocity is a debt. Shedding it requires more energy than escaping the solar system entirely. The Parker Solar Probe, which studies the Sun at close range, used 7 gravity assists from Venus over 7 years to gradually bleed off orbital velocity and lower its closest approach distance. Even then, it does not fall into the Sun. It merely passes close on highly elliptical orbits that Venus's gravity helped shape. Gravity gives freely, but it charges dearly for what it gives, the moment you try to return the gift. The distinction between reaching space and operating in space is critical. Reaching space, getting above the atmosphere, requires roughly 1.4 kilometers per second of vertical velocity and is modest compared to what follows. Reaching orbit requires approximately 7.8 kilometers per second of horizontal velocity, achieved through sustained thrust against gravity during ascent. But operating in space, traveling between orbits, transferring between planets, inserting into destination orbits, maintaining position, rendezvousing with other spacecraft requires an ongoing series of precisely calculated velocity changes, each debited against a finite fuel supply, each priced by the gravitational fields of the bodies involved. The delta-V budget is not a suggestion, it is a hard limit. When it is exhausted, no further maneuvers are possible. The spacecraft becomes a passive object, falling along whatever trajectory gravity assigns it. This is why mission planning is, at its core, gravitational accounting. Before a spacecraft is designed, before materials are selected, before instruments are chosen, engineers map the delta-V costs of every phase. They calculate the propellant mass required for each maneuver. They trace those masses backward through the mission, adding them to the payload at each preceding stage. They determine whether the total mass at launch falls within the capability of available rockets. If it does not, They look for ways to reduce costs. Gravity assists that borrow velocity, aerobraking that trades fuel for heat shielding, staging that discards dead mass. Every strategy is a negotiation with gravity's fixed prices. None of them changes the prices themselves. The toll system is built into the fabric of space-time, written by the same equations that govern the orbits of planets and the fall of apples. It has operated without modification since the formation of the solar system, and will continue operating long after every spacecraft humanity has built has crumbled to dust. The solar system is not a void to be crossed. It is a gravitational landscape to be navigated, and every slope, every valley, every ridge in that landscape extracts a cost from anything that tries to move across it. Getting to orbit is climbing out of the deepest local valley. Transferring between planets is traversing ridges between neighboring basins. Arriving at a destination is descending into a new valley. And every meter of ascent and descent requires energy. Energy that comes from fuel. Fuel that has mass. Mass that gravity taxes at every stage. The ledger runs continuously. The prices are posted in the laws of physics, and nothing moves between worlds without paying every charge in full. But as steep as these transit costs are, they pale beside what comes next. Because the most punishing phase of any mission is not the journey between worlds. It is what happens when you try to land on one and then leave again. Every robotic probe that has ever landed on another world shares one uncomfortable truth with every probe that merely flew past. The flyby missions kept going. The landers had to stop. And stopping, in a universe governed by gravitational physics, is not passive. It is not the absence of motion. It is an act of controlled violence, a deliberate, fuel-burning confrontation with the velocity that gravity itself bestowed during approach. A spacecraft falling toward Mars arrives at roughly 5.5 kilometers per second, relative to the planet. A spacecraft approaching the Moon arrives at over 800 meters per second after its descent from lunar orbit. These velocities must be removed completely before the vehicle touches